Imagine a cave that has never known silence, because silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so still it makes ordinary noise seem like a distraction. Deep beneath the ice of Ilum, in the blue dark hours before any Padawan has ever arrived, there is a hum. Not a sound you would hear with your ears, exactly, but one you might feel at the base of your sternum if you sat very still and let the world come to you instead of reaching for it. That hum is alive. It has been alive for longer than any language has existed to describe it, and it is waiting, though not the way a thing waits when it is bored or impatient. It is waiting the way the ocean waits for the shore. It is waiting, because waiting for a Kyber crystal is not a state of incompletion. It is a state of perfect, humming readiness. This is the story of a stone that is not merely a stone. Every civilization that has ever looked long enough at the natural world has arrived, eventually, at the same unnerving suspicion that matter and consciousness are not as separate as they appear. That the rocks beneath your feet and the thoughts inside your head may be two expressions of a single underlying reality. In the Star Wars universe, this suspicion is not philosophy, but physics. The Kyber crystal is a geological formation that somehow, inexplicably, maintains an active and directional relationship with the Force. It is not merely a conduit, the way a wire conducts electricity. It is a participant. The distinction matters enormously. A wire does not care what it carries. A Kyber crystal cares very much. What the crystal is, at its most fundamental level, is a bridge. On one side of that bridge is the physical universe, mass, temperature, molecular structure, the cold blue light refracted through its facets. On the other side is the living force, that dimension of the Force which flows through and around all living things, which carries intention and emotion and the subtle currents of fate. The Kyber crystal exists at the crossing point. It is made of rock, but it listens like a living thing. And what it listens for, always, is alignment. Not power, not brilliance. Not even virtue in the simple moral sense. Alignment, the quality of a being whose inner life and outer action have become harmonious, who does not force the Force, but moves with it, the way water moves with the shape of the land it crosses. In the caves of Ilum, before a single Padawan has entered for the season's gathering, the crystals are not dormant. This is a misunderstanding that many who approach the tradition from the outside tend to carry with them, and it is worth setting aside carefully. Dormancy implies that something is switched off, waiting to be switched on. The Kyber crystals of Ilum are not switched off. They are in a state of perpetual inward attention, which is a different thing entirely. Consider what it would mean to be a being of pure perception, with no body requiring food or rest, no ego requiring validation, no time pressure of any kind, simply aware, simply present, simply listening to the vast hum of the living universe for as long as it takes. That is closer to what the crystals are doing. When multiple crystals are grouped in proximity, as they are in the great chambers of Ilum, their individual resonances do not merely coexist. They harmonize. They create, through their overlapping frequencies, something that functions like a collective voice, a subterranean choir in a register no instrument has ever quite replicated, singing a song with no words and no beginning and no assigned end. This choir has a direction. That is the detail that stops you cold when you sit with it long enough. The resonance of the Kyber crystals is not neutral. It is oriented toward the light side of the Force, the way a flower is oriented toward sunlight, not through choice exactly, but through the deepest nature of what it is. When a being approaches the crystal caves, carrying darkness, carrying aggression, carrying the will to dominate, the crystals go cold in a way that is not merely physical. They withdraw. They become unavailable. They recognize, through some mechanism the Jedi never claimed to fully understand, that the approaching energy is incompatible with their nature, and they simply cease to extend themselves toward it. This is not judgment in any legalistic sense. It is resonance and its absence. A bell cannot ring for a frequency it was not shaped to carry. The Imperial scientists who came to understand this, or tried to, were men like Orson Krennic, and researchers who worked alongside Galen Erso in the program that eventually produced the Death Star. Galen Erso, a brilliant man who would spend years in the moral wilderness of Imperial weapons research before escaping its gravity, understood something through his work with Kyber energy that haunted him. That the energy stored within a Kyber crystal is not simply large. It is, in practical terms, nearly boundless. The crystals channel and amplify the Force itself, and the Force is not a finite resource. When the Empire began harvesting Kyber on an industrial scale, stripping the caves of Ilum, demolishing the holy city of Jedha stone by stone to feed the reactors of a planet-sized weapon, they were not merely stealing rocks. They were harnessing a power that was never meant to be harnessed, converting something alive into something dead and directional, redirecting the infinite patience of the living stone into a single terrible focus point of annihilation. The Kyber in the Death Star superlaser did not power it the way coal powers a furnace. It amplified it, multiplied it, bent the Force itself into a beam capable of destroying a world. And what that reflects, if you think about it carefully, is not only the cruelty of the Empire, but the scale of what was being violated. The question that hangs in the air of every cave on Ilum, on Jedha, on Dantooine, is this: what does it mean for something to have an allegiance? What does it mean for a stone, a piece of the physical world, to hold an ethical orientation? The answer the Kyber crystals give is quiet and absolute. It means that some things cannot be used for certain purposes without being broken in the process. And breaking them has consequences that those who wield the broken thing will eventually come to understand. The Gathering, as the Jedi tradition named it, was never a test of courage in the simple sense. No one was asked to fight anything. No one was asked to climb or swim or endure physical pain. The journey to Ilum at the right season, at the age of Padawanhood, was an inward journey dressed in the costume of an outward one. The ice was real, the cold was real, the caves were real. But what the caves contained for each young Jedi was not a crystal hidden in a specific location that required sufficient cleverness to locate. What the caves contained was a mirror. And the mirror showed you, with perfect clarity and without any mercy, exactly what you were most afraid of. Petro, who was brave with his fists but proud, faced a version of himself who had abandoned his friends and taken his crystal alone and early, who stood in the cave holding his prize while his companions were lost. The vision was not designed to shame him. It was designed to let him see what his competitiveness looked like from outside it and to choose, again, in full awareness. Katuni, who doubted her own abilities with quiet persistence, came face to face with her deepest certainty that she would fail and had to stand in that certainty long enough to discover that it was not certainty at all, but only fear wearing certainty's clothing. Gungi, the young Wookiee, who was gentle in the way that only the very large and very powerful can afford to be, found his trial in the space between violence and restraint. The discovery that the crystal he sought could only be reached when his strength was completely at peace, when his power was not dormant, but present without aggression. Bife faced the paralysis of fear directly, a fear so physical it locked his limbs, and had to learn not to defeat it, but to move anyway, to let fear exist alongside motion, rather than demanding that fear leave before action was permitted. Zat, who trusted data and logic the way others trust the Force, walked into a scenario where none of his calculations helped him, where the only available information was whatever he felt and had to build a bridge, however rickety, across the gap between what he knew and what he sensed. And Ganodi, who doubted not herself but the crystal, who stood in the cave for what felt like forever with a quiet, gnawing worry that nothing was calling to her, that she was the Padawan who simply would not be chosen. She had to learn that the absence of obvious connection was not rejection. It was invitation to a different kind of listening. Yoda stood at the entrance to the caves and did not follow them in. This is one of the most instructive moments in the entire tradition, and it is worth pausing on. Yoda, ancient beyond measure, as attuned to the Force as any being alive, could have guided those Padawans every step of the way. He could have whispered through the Force, pointed toward the correct chambers, gently nudged each young one toward their crystal and away from their fear. He chose not to. He chose to wait at the mouth of the cave in the bitter cold and trust that whatever the cave was doing, it was doing correctly. The masters could not accompany the young ones, not simply because of tradition or rule, but because of metaphysics. The trial the caves offered was precisely the trial of being alone, of standing inside your own mind without a teacher to catch you when the floor fell away. A guide present in that space would have changed the nature of the space. The cave worked because it was unmediated. The mirror showed what the mirror showed, without a companion who had already made peace with their own reflections, standing beside you to soften yours. Other planets beyond Ilum held Kyber crystals, and each location had its own character, its own relationship with the Force, and with the beings who came seeking. On Dantooine, the crystals were said to lie in valleys and rivers, as well as caves, more accessible, less dramatic, appropriate perhaps for a planet that was itself more gentle and open than Ilum's austere frozen silence. On Lothal, a place threaded through with particularly alive and wild currents of the Force, Kyber was found in a landscape that seemed almost to breathe, where the boundary between rock and Force felt thinner than almost anywhere else in the known galaxy. And then there was Jedha. Jedha was not merely a place where Kyber was found. Jedha was a civilization that grew up around Kyber. The holy city of Jedha was built on a theological foundation that recognized the crystals as objects of sacred significance, and the pilgrims and priests and guardians who filled its streets came from every tradition that understood the Force, under every different name and practice they used to describe it. The Temple of the Kyber stood in the city's heart, and the crystals housed within it were not weapons and not tools. They were objects of contemplation, of devotion, of something very close to what our own traditions would call holy relics. When the Death Star fired upon Jedha City in a demonstration of power so casual, it still seems, even in hindsight, almost beyond comprehension. It was not simply a military strike. It was a spiritual desecration of the deepest possible order, an entire sacred tradition, centuries of accumulated reverence for the living stone, the gathered crystals, the streets worn smooth by generations of feet that came seeking whatever it is that human and non-human beings alike go seeking when they have run out of ordinary answers, all of it turned to vapor in a single second. The Empire did not merely understand this, it chose it. The symbolic weight was entirely intentional. When a Padawan finds their crystal, or rather when the crystal finds the Padawan, that distinction is important, and the Jedi were careful about it. Something happens that is difficult to describe from the outside, and that from the inside tends to be described in language that hovers very close to the language of recognition. Not discovery, recognition. As if the Padawan had known this crystal before, in some version of existence or memory that has no name, and is now simply acknowledging what was already true. The crystal has been waiting, as we said, but its waiting was not passive accumulation of time. It was active sensing, reaching out across whatever distance the Force permits perception, oriented specifically toward the particular quality of living force that this one young Jedi carries. The crystal goes warm. It becomes visible when it was invisible before. It moves toward the Padawan's hand. And in that moment, something changes in both of them. The crystal shifts from dormant, attuned, to actively bonded. And the Padawan shifts from seeker to found. Whether you are a Jedi or simply someone alive in the world, you will recognize, at least distantly, what it feels like to finally be found. In the Jedi tradition, the construction of a lightsaber was not a craft project. It was a sacrament. The word sacrament comes from a root meaning something made holy through action. And this distinction that holiness can be created through the quality of attention brought to an act rather than being the exclusive property of designated sacred objects is exactly what the lightsaber construction process embodied. The components required were technical: the focusing crystals, the modulation circuits, the power cell, the emitter matrix. The hand grip formed and shaped and calibrated for the specific grip of its maker. You could, in theory, put these pieces together with ordinary tools and ordinary attention. The result would be a device that worked, technically. But that was not what the ritual was for. The Padawan would enter a deep meditative state, a state so still and so inwardly directed that the boundary between self and force became permeable. And from within that state, using only the force as their hands, they would guide the components together around the crystal. The crystal was not placed at the center like a battery into a device. It was welcomed there. The Jedi understood, through long experience with the nature of the bond, that the crystal needed to recognize the lightsaber it was being asked to inhabit, the same way it had recognized the Padawan who carried it. This was done in silence and in stillness. And the Jedi Masters who oversaw the process noted consistently that the quality of the resulting weapon was a direct reflection of the quality of the practitioner's inner state during construction. A Padawan who forced the process, who grew impatient or frustrated, would produce a weapon that hummed with a slight wrongness, a barely perceptible dissonance that the Padawan themselves would feel in their palm every time they held it. A Padawan who achieved genuine stillness, who completed the construction from within, a place of full presence and quiet attentiveness, produced something that felt, from the first moment of ignition, like an extension of their own arm. Not a tool attached to the hand, a continuation of it. The color of the blade was never chosen. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful mechanics in the entire Kyber tradition, and it is philosophically rich enough to sit with for a long time. The crystal, in its dormant state, was colorless or white. Upon bonding with its Padawan, upon being placed at the heart of a lightsaber and ignited for the first time, the blade emerged in a color that was not selected from a palette but revealed from within, a color that reflected the particular quality of the Force as the Padawan related to it, the particular flavor of their attunement. Blue emerged most commonly among those whose relationship with the Force was primarily active, protective, and oriented toward the defense of others, the Guardians, who were warriors in the fullest sense, not because they loved combat, but because they loved what they were protecting. Green was the color of those for whom the Force was primarily a thing to be deeply known and meditated upon, whose path ran through philosophy and perception, rather than the battlefield, the consulars, who carried their lightsabers rarely and sometimes almost reluctantly, preferring to solve problems at the level of understanding rather than action. Yellow blades, rarer and less discussed, belong to those who balance the roles of guardian and consular, the sentinels, the temple guards, those who stood watch between the two poles and found their own equilibrium there. And then there was the purple blade of Mace Windu, which the Jedi Order itself could not fully categorize because it was genuinely singular. The purple blade did not belong to any established tradition of color. It emerged from Windu's specific and unprecedented relationship with the Force, a relationship that included something the Order was deeply cautious about: the deliberate, conscious awareness of the dark side, not as something to be fled, but as something to be understood from the inside, close enough to comprehend and far enough to resist. Windu walked an edge that no one else in his era could walk safely, and his purple blade was the crystal's acknowledgement of that. Not an endorsement, not a warning, simply a record, rendered in light. What it means that the lightsaber is not a tool, but an extension of the Jedi is something that sounds poetic until you encounter the moments where it becomes literal. A Jedi in full attunement with the Force, in the deepest possible state of presence and alignment, does not decide to swing the blade. The blade moves because the Jedi's perception of what needs to happen and the Force's understanding of the situation are no longer two separate things. The lightsaber, at that level, is not an object in the hand. It is a visible edge on something invisible. There's a phrase that appears in various forms across Jedi teachings, across every version of the tradition that has been recorded. The best Jedi move is the one that did not require moving. The lightsaber, in the hands of a truly attuned practitioner, was evidence of the principle behind that phrase. It was necessary precisely as often as it was necessary, and not a moment more. Now we must slow down. What comes next requires it. If what we have described so far is the arc of light crystal, found in sacred cave, crystal bonded to young Jedi, crystal singing in the heart of a lightsaber as its wielder learns to move as one with the Force, then what comes next is the shadow that makes the light visible. And the shadow has a name: bleeding. To understand bleeding, you must first understand what the Sith tradition required and what it cost. A Sith, by the architecture of their philosophy, could not simply go to Ilum or Dantooine and find a crystal waiting to recognize them. The Kyber crystal's allegiance to the light side of the Force meant that it would not respond to the Sith's reaching the way it would respond to a Jedi's. It would not go warm. It would not become visible. It would not move toward the outstretched hand. So the Sith did not seek a crystal. They took one. They killed for one. And having taken one, they then did something to it that changes the nature of the conversation entirely. After the fall, after the transformation from Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader, there came a moment that is documented in the comics with a specificity that makes it hard to look at directly. Vader had lost his crystal, the crystal that had once been Anakin's, and he needed a new one. He tracked down a Jedi Master named Infila, who had taken a vow that kept him separate from the Clone Wars, who lived in isolation on a moon far from the conflicts of the galaxy. Vader did not challenge Infila out of necessity. He chose him. He killed him on the cliff of a waterfall in a fight that was brutal and strange and suffused with grief. And he took Infila's crystal from the ruined lightsaber, and then alone in the wreckage of his own becoming, he bled it. Bleeding a crystal is not a technical process. It is a spiritual assault, and calling it anything else would be a lie. The crystal, as we have established, is alive. It is bonded to the light side of the Force as a matter of its deepest nature. When a Sith takes that crystal in their hands and pours their pain into it, their rage, their grief, their sense of abandonment and betrayal, their conviction that the universe owes them a debt that can only be settled through power, the crystal resists. This is documented in canon as something that can be felt, that has texture and weight. The crystal fights back. In Vader's case, the crystal showed him visions, pulled him into a Force experience where he confronted every person he had failed, every death he had caused, every version of himself he had killed to become the thing he was. It showed him the faces of everyone who had trusted him, and everyone he had destroyed, and everyone who had loved him, and everyone he had lost. And the crystal did this not to torment him, or not only to torment him, but because the crystal was fighting with everything it had to preserve its nature. The light side of the Force ran through that crystal like a current, and the current was fighting the hand that was trying to dam it and reverse it and force it backward. The Sith wins this fight by refusing to stop. The bleeding is not a single moment. It is an extended act of will, sustained through pain, sustained through the vision and the grief and the full weight of everything the Sith has become. It is, in the most literal sense, a choice to continue hurting something until it breaks. And eventually, it breaks. The crystal goes crimson. The red blade that ignites from a bled crystal is not merely a different color. It is a different substance, morally speaking. It is a weapon whose light is not a reflection of the wielder's attunement to the Force, but a record of their refusal to be refused. Every saber cast red carries inside it the echo of the thing that was done to it. The Sith do not experience this as a cost, or they train themselves not to, but the feedback is always there. A bled crystal amplifies the dark emotions it was formed by. It makes grief larger and more actionable, makes rage cleaner and more satisfying, makes the isolation of the Sith path feel less like isolation and more like clarity. And in this way, the weapon that was made through pain continues to make pain. The loop is closed. The crystal that once participated in the living harmony of the Force now participates in its own corruption, amplifying the thing that wounded it. Set against this, Ahsoka Tano, on a moon called Ra'ada, surrounded by Imperial forces, confronting an Inquisitor named the Sixth Brother who had been sent to find her, who had tracked her across her hiding and her becoming, who met her at the moment she had finally, after everything, decided to stop hiding. She killed the Sixth Brother. She took his lightsaber apart in her hands, still feeling the shape of what she had done, and found inside it 2 red crystals, bleeding and blooded and corrupted, aching with the weight of whatever the Inquisitor had done to them and whatever had been done to him before that. And Ahsoka Tano, who was not a Jedi anymore and knew it, who had walked out of the Order in pain and had spent years learning to be a person rather than a soldier, who understood what loss was and what survival cost, and what it meant to continue living in a universe that had mostly stopped being kind. Ahsoka Tano sat down with those broken crystals and did something no documented practitioner before her had attempted at that scale and in those circumstances. She tried to heal them. The purification of a Kyber crystal is the inverse of bleeding. Where bleeding is an act of sustained imposition, purification is an act of sustained invitation. The crystal, even in its bled state, retains some memory of what it was. The light side allegiance is not destroyed by bleeding. It is suppressed, buried, held down by the weight of imposed pain. To purify a crystal is to find that buried current and call to it, to offer it a path back to the surface, to stand with your own pain and your own grief and your own complicated history and say, without pretending any of it is simple, the force is larger than what was done to you. The force is larger than what was done to me. Come back. The crystals came back. But they did not come back to their original color. They did not return to the blue or green of their Jedi life before the sixth brother found them and forced them through the dark. They came back white, a color that had not been seen in a Kyber crystal before, or had not been recorded, or had been lost in the destruction of so much else. White, the color of all colors combined, the color of a prism source before it makes its choices, the color of a thing that has been through fire and emerged with no allegiance except to the truth of what it is. The philosophical weight of this is immense, and it is worth sitting with very quietly. Ahsoka's white blades said by their very color that what she carried was not the light side tradition she had been trained in and left. It was not the Jedi Order's blue or the Sith's corrupted red. It was something else, something arrived at through pain and through healing, through loss, and through the choice to keep trying anyway. The crystal's whiteness was not neutrality. Neutral things do not require that level of suffering to achieve. The whiteness was a record of having been wounded deeply and having been loved back into wholeness. And that, the tradition seems to say, is something different, and perhaps something more than having never been wounded at all. The question of what it does to a person, to a Sith, to carry a weapon saturated in the pain of the thing that made it this, is a question the dark side tradition has never answered honestly. Because the dark side tradition does not ask honest questions. It asks useful ones. But the honest answer, if you look at the Sith Lords across their history and follow the spiral of their lives, is that it makes them more of what they already were. The crystal does not transform the Sith. It amplifies them. And amplification is not neutral in a being whose foundation is pain. You cannot amplify grief and become happy. You cannot turn up the volume on rage and find peace. The blood crystal is, for the Sith who carries it, a kind of trap that was built into the weapon at the moment of its creation, and that the Sith entered with eyes open or eyes shut, which amounts to the same thing. The blade is red. The debt keeps growing. Now we are approaching the place where the story opens out into something larger than lightsabers and larger than the war between light and dark. We are approaching the place where the Kyber crystal, in all its history and all its meaning, points outward toward the question that every tradition that has ever touched on the nature of consciousness eventually arrives at: what happens after? The Force, in the cosmology of Star Wars, is not a single thing. It is layered. There is the living force, which flows through and around all living things, which is immediate and present and responsive, which is what a Jedi feels when they open themselves to the moment, the current that carried Qui-Gon Jinn's attention, the way a river carries a leaf always present, always in motion. And there is the cosmic force, which is something different and much harder to describe. The cosmic force is the larger pattern, the thing that remains when the living things are gone, the current that existed before life arose and will exist after the last living thing has ceased to exist. It is not impersonal in the cold mechanical sense. It is beyond personal and impersonal both. It is the ocean beneath the river. It is the silence that makes the hum possible. Kyber crystals, as living force objects, exist in both domains simultaneously. They are physical and they are force attuned, which means they participate in the immediate current of the living force, and through that participation, are connected to the larger pattern of the cosmic force as well. What this means for their eventual end, for the question of what becomes of a Kyber crystal that is shattered or buried in the rubble of a dead planet, or simply lost in the long darkness between stars, is something the Jedi did not claim to know fully. But they had thoughts, they had observations, and they had Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn is an interesting figure to end with, because he was, in many ways, a Jedi who disagreed with the Jedi. Not in the sense of betrayal, but in the sense of someone who loved a tradition enough to see its blind spots clearly. Qui-Gon trusted the living force more than the Jedi High Council, trusted the immediate presence of the force in this moment over the long strategic calculations that the council conducted from their temple. He was dismissed for this at times. He was passed over for a seat on the council. He died before he could complete what he was beginning to understand. But what he was beginning to understand turned out to be the most important discovery in Jedi history. The possibility of retaining conscious identity after death, of returning as a voice from the cosmic force, of being present without being alive in the biological sense. The Kyber crystal, in this context, becomes something strange and beautiful. If the force can carry the consciousness of a Jedi beyond death, if the energy of a life lived in attunement to the force does not simply dissipate when the body fails, but transforms into something that can still speak and be heard, then what of the crystal that was bonded to that Jedi? What of the stone that spent years resonating to the specific frequency of a specific human or alien life, that learned the particular quality of a single being's connection to the force, that carried that connection in its lattice structure, the way a tree carries its rings? There is a phenomenon documented in the journals and in the experiences of those who trained in the Jedi way as something called force echoes. The idea is simple and unsettling and quietly beautiful. That significant events charged with intense force energy, leave impressions in the physical locations and objects associated with them. In the crystal caves of Bogano, in the ruins of ancient temples, in the places where great battles were fought or great sacrifices made, a force-sensitive being can sometimes perceive, not simply remember or imagine, but genuinely perceive the shape of what happened there. Not the visual details, necessarily. The emotional truth of it, the weight of it. The force echo is not a ghost in the dramatic sense. It is more like the way a piece of music can carry in its vibration the whole emotional landscape of the person who wrote it, such that listening to it is not simply aesthetic experience, but a kind of contact, a kind of being known across time. If this is true of places and objects generally, then it is almost certainly true of Kyber crystals specifically, and perhaps more deeply. A Kyber crystal that bonded with a Jedi, that was present at the moment of their greatest clarity and their deepest grief, and their final choice, that crystal carries all of it. The Force does not forget. The crystal does not forget. The Jedi Masters who built their lightsabers with such care and meditative attention, who lived inside that relationship for decades, who chose the shape of their lives through the quality of their connection to the living stone, they are perhaps still in some sense present there. Not as hauntings, as hums, as the faintest resonance in the crystal's lattice, speaking in a frequency too low for ordinary listening, waiting for someone still enough to hear it. This is speculation, as a narration of any tradition that takes its mystery seriously must sometimes be. The Jedi did not make formal claims about what persisted in the crystal after the Jedi's death, but they built their most important rituals around the crystal's living nature, around its capacity for relationship, around the deep and reciprocal bond between the stone and the person, and they understood in the way you understand something, not through argument, but through long attention, that this bond was not fully erased by any event they had yet witnessed. Not by the crystal being separated from its Jedi, not by the Jedi's death, not by the crystal being embedded in a new lightsaber carried by a new practitioner who might never have met the one who came before. The crystal, as a living force object, retained something. It always retained something. And perhaps this is why the destruction of Jedha and the caves of Ilum and the stripping of Dantooine was so much worse than it appeared at the level of strategic military analysis. What the Empire destroyed was not simply a supply of raw material for Jedi weapons. It was the accumulated memory of the Force, stored in stone across centuries. It was the library of a people written not in words, but in resonance. When a Kyber crystal is shattered, the energy it held is not lost. The cosmic force does not lose things. But the particular shape of what it held, the specific frequency of a specific Jedi's specific life, that shape may not survive the shattering. The note may return to the ocean. The melody is over. This is the point where the tradition, if it is honest with itself, arrives at grief. Not the performative grief of someone who has lost something they owned, but the quieter grief of someone who stands in a world that is less than it was and knows there is no reversing it. The Jedi understood impermanence. They were taught it from their youngest years, taught that attachment to outcomes and to permanence was the beginning of the path that led toward the dark. But understanding impermanence intellectually is different from standing in the rubble of Jedha City and knowing that something irreplaceable is gone. The Kyber tradition, in its full form, acknowledged both truths. Things end. The Force does not end. Both are true, and they do not cancel each other out. You are allowed to grieve, and you are not required to pretend the grief is final. The caves of Ilum are silent now, in a way they were not silent before. The Empire came and carved them open, stripped them of what had taken geological ages and the slow patience of the Force to build. The crystals that remain are fewer. The choir that once filled those blue chambers is reduced to something smaller and more fragile. And yet the Force does not shout. It has never shouted. It does not mark its own losses with noise or announcement. Whatever remains of Kyber in the galaxy goes on humming, quietly, in whatever darkness or light it finds itself in, maintaining its orientation toward the light side of the Force, with the same absolute consistency it maintained before any Jedi ever arrived to receive it. There is something worth attending to in that consistency. The crystal does not require acknowledgement. It does not require that its allegiance be recognized or rewarded or even noticed. It simply is what it is, as completely as it can be, for as long as it exists. It is attuned to the light side because the light side is what it is, not because of any reward for the loyalty or any consequence for the abandonment. It is one of the most complete expressions in the entire mythology of something that could be called virtue without self-consciousness, the quality of acting from your nature rather than from the expectation of outcome. No one watches the Kyber crystal and no one needs to. It hums its hum in the dark all the same. The Force hums. It does not announce. It does not insist. It waits with the patience of something that has no deadline and no fear of being missed, and it is available to anyone still enough and quiet enough and willing enough to set down for a moment the noise of their own urgency and simply listen. Not for an answer, not for a direction, not for confirmation that you are on the right path or that you will be all right. Simply to listen to the hum that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave, the hum that moves through the crystal and through the cave and through the cold and through everything living and everything that has ever been alive and everything that is in some sense still. The Kyber crystal does not announce itself. It waits to be recognized. The deepest truths in any tradition worth the name behave the same way. They do not come to you. You come to them slowly after a great deal of noise, and you find that they were always there in the last place you think to look, which is the silence you kept meaning to visit and never quite managed to reach. You reach it eventually. Most people reach it eventually. Sometimes it takes a cave and a vision and a hand that goes cold before it goes warm again. Sometimes it takes a loss so complete that the noise simply stops. Sometimes it takes sitting very still in the dark for long enough that the dark becomes, if not comfortable, at least familiar. And in the familiarity, you notice something you had not noticed before. A faint and steady sound, below hearing, in the chest, like something very old and very patient breathing, like something that has been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly as long as it takes, and is in absolutely no hurry to go anywhere at all.